howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. What I wanted to do today, now that we're 15 days into the Affliction League, is take a look at the solo self-found meta that's been developing. This is a look at builds that have been doing well in the softcore solo self-found mode of the game. Now a quick note that even if you don't play solo self-found, you might find that this is still useful because builds that perform well in solo self-found axiomatically perform at least equally well in Trade League, and potentially they'll have a few additional options open up as well. So it can be worth looking at what's doing well in SSF, even if, like me, you're a Trade League enjoyer. The same isn't necessarily true in reverse. Builds that work well in Trade can sometimes really rely upon specific unique items or specific nuances of group play. I'll also mention that this is the second video I've done on the 3.23 meta, but they don't need to be watched in any particular order. If you haven't caught the one on Trade League yet, then I'll put a link to it down in the description of this video below. So methodology here. Grinding Gear Games published the ladder. This is a list of the top 15,000 characters by XP. You can opt out of being on the ladder, but most players don't do this. What this gives you is an overview of popular build archetypes, and popularity often but not always correlates with success. The website PoE.ninja scrapes this data. Now, I could take all 15,000 odd players on it, but what I've chosen to do is trim it off at level 92. So we're going to be looking at the top 6,161 characters, which is the number of people who are 92 plus at the time that PoE Ninja took their day 14 scraping of the ladder. Now generally being level 92 plus, this means that you've done at least 2 Void Stones, and you've probably done at least 95% of the regular maps on the Atlas, as well as a few of the unique maps. In short, your character's demonstrated that they can do a variety of different things by this point. Now, it's worth remembering solo self-found is extremely unfriendly as a game mode to builds that absolutely require certain uniques. But Affliction kind of goes against this because a lot of the drop anywhere uniques have essentially a much higher drop rate this league than normal. A bit more on that later when we start looking at why Taste of Hate and Lightning Coil are seeing so much more use than they've seen in the past. So the first thing that stands out if you have a quick look at the meta is that the Guardian is the dominant Ascendancy. In softcore trade, it's a Sea of Deadeyes. In softcore solo self-found, it's a different hero that's emerged, and that is the Guardian. It's not that the Guardian is necessarily an overwhelmingly strong Ascendancy, it's that it is just really solid at doing one thing. The Summon Raging Spirit Guardian is a build that's very well rounded, very solid, and it's very suited to the specifics of solo self-found because the primary character power progression in it is actually the character's level, up to level 85. From the point that you get your second Labyrinth done, every time your character levels up, you're going to get a noticeable increase in the power of your summoned elemental relics, and this is going to translate into a large and growing amount of flat elemental damage that your summoned Raging Spirits deal. Now this can also apply to other minions as well. You could use this with, say, Summon Skeletons instead. It's just that Summon Raging Spirit is the strongest of these minions at the moment. So its offense is scaling with the Ascendancy, not with your gear. That means early on, you can focus your gearing on the very basics, focus on getting things like life, resistances on all pieces of equipment, and then once you start looking to advance further, there are still options for the Guardian to advance further than that. Now there is a unique item that has been made much more common this league than it was last league, and that is Maata's Teachings, but it's not really a factor here. It's a very good item, it's solid on a Summon Raging Spirit Guardian, but few people are using it because it's rare. It's a tier 2 drop anywhere unique, which means that it's the same rarity as Chevron's Wrappings, same rarity as Mjolnir, and most people just don't have it. And whilst tier 2 rarity uniques are a bit more common than they've been in the past, they're still not so common that people have them on what is likely to be their first build of the league. But a little bit more on drop anywhere uniques later. Now, let's talk quickly about the impact of buffs and nerfs. Righteous Fire's popularity has fallen off a cliff between 3.22, where it was 9% of the meta on day 14, and 3.23, where it is 1.5% of the meta. Now, there's nothing wrong with Ivory Tower-based Righteous Fire builds at the moment. These are still quite good, but they're just tough to pull together in a solo self-found environment. You pretty much need to get your hands on Shaper's Touch, Prism Guardian, Ivory Tower itself, Legacy of Fury, and probably Chevron's Revelation as well. Getting all of these takes quite a bit of dedication, especially given that Chevron's Revelation is a tier 2 drop anywhere unique that only has 2 pretty impractical divination cards to chase. Then there's the Ivory Tower itself, which at tier 3 you'll probably get before you hit level 95, but even then that's not guaranteed either. Then you've got to have the ability to deal with bosses to get Shaper's Touch and Legacy of Fury if you want those, and you're going to want to get Prism Guardian, which has a divination card but one that takes quite some time to farm. In short, while it's definitely possible for the Obsessed player to pull together one of these Righteous Fire Ivory Tower builds, it is definitely not something that I would recommend for someone's first build. This is very different to the simplicity of getting 3.22 era Righteous Fire rolling. Now, other things that have changed. Boneshatter has been nerfed in a way that really only affects Trade League. Divergent Boneshatter is gone, and there's nothing that replaces it. But in Solo Self-Found, this is pretty much a non-issue, because most people were not getting Divergent Boneshatter anyway. The baseline Boneshatter gem is still fine, and there's also a Transfigured version that's pretty good as well, although not necessarily for every build. One thing I do think we're going to see though, is that Cleave may have a bit of a resurgence in popularity this league. There is a build based around Cleave of Rage that, whilst it's not trivial to pull together in SSF, every piece of it that's critical is target farmable or is tier 4 or more common, and as a result, I do think it is possible to pull together a Cleave of Rage build in this league. So that's something to consider. You're not necessarily going to get the Saviour and a top tier Psychotic Axe like you could get in Trade League, but you can get some pretty impressive stuff in SSF anyway. I think there's a solid case to be made that Cleave of Rage has taken over as the best melee skill in the game, although not something that's quite as easy to get rolling as Boneshatter is. So all in all, melee has a little bit more in the way of options than it did last league, and Boneshatter's nerfs only really affect Trade League players, and maybe the most hardcore of the SSF player base. So let's talk about uniques, because there's something very important that's going to influence a number of build decisions people are already making in SSF. A big part of Solo Self-Found is that you just are locked out of genuinely rare items unless either you get very lucky or you have a very determined farming strategy for them. And it's important to know just what the rare uniques are. Perhaps you conclude that no, you're not willing to try and chase down Arakali's Fang and the Squire, but that you are willing to chase down the Ivory Tower because it's something like 12 times as common as Arakali's Fang. For a bit of an example as to just how locked out of some of these rare items you can be, there are only 3 high-level characters in the league that have got Nimbus equipped on them. 2 of them are item level 87, so those have been Uber Eater of Worlds drops, and 1 of them is item level 80, and therefore came from divination cards. You probably wouldn't farm Fire of Unknown Origins through traditional divination card farming. Instead, what I would expect would have happened here is that someone's received that as a reward either for Gravicius in the Betrayal system, or for anything else that can award a full set of divination cards. Another possibility is that one of them was a natural drop, and then that was gambled up through the Double or Nothing Harvest Craft all the way up to a full set. That doesn't happen for most individuals that attempt to do that, but if enough individuals do get an RNG Nimbus card drop, then some of them are going to end up with a complete set that way. But 6,161 level 92 plus players, only 3 of them wearing Nimbus. There's something very unusual though this league when it comes to drop anywhere uniques. I want to start by considering Taste of Hate. Now this is a drop anywhere tier 2 rarity unique, and it has a divination card. The divination card is between 2.5 and 3 times as rare as the Fortunate, the divination card that is essentially 1/6 of a divine orb. Now farming the hunger card is possible, but it requires quite a bit of determination. When thinking about getting a divination card set, one of the things that I think of is what's your path of least resistance to acquiring this in Solo Self-Found. For example, if the divination card you were thinking of was the Chains That Bind, your path of least resistance, if you don't care about anything else, is going to be to farm it in Act 5, because that's reasonably quick. It's not super fast, but it's reasonable. On the flip side, for a divination card like Taste of Hate, it's that much rarer that that does not become an option. Instead, what your path of least resistance is going to look like is firstly you want to rush to unlocking 4, 5 or 6 of the favourite map slots, and then once you've done that, lock your Atlas so that you're mostly getting maps that can drop Taste of Hate divination card, and once you've done that, you're then going to want to farm to about level 95 in those maps, and along the way, you should get 9 copies of the Hunger to drop for you. So you can see how that's quite a bit more of an ordeal than farming some of the more common cards. But on the flip side, it's also not nearly as much of an ideal as farming, for example, the Doctor, where to get a set of 8 copies of the Doctor, your pathway of least resistance is going to include pretty much doing the entirety of the Atlas, then on top of doing the entire Atlas, getting yourself all 12 favourite map slots, getting all 4 Void Stones, and that's just the setup phase. Once you've done that, then you start farming Burial Chambers until you've got your set of 8 cards. The reason I raise that is to say that getting the Taste of Hate through divination cards was not a trivial thing. It required considerable investment of time and effort, and spending a lot of time in map tile sets that a lot of players don't like. But it was something that was doable. That was the pre-3.23 status quo. Let's talk about how that's changed in patch 3.23, where the divination card option is no easier, but getting Taste of Hate as a direct drop from a monster is far, far, far more common. And this is just mass producing uniques as direct drops from monsters, with a view that even if only 1 in 5,000 uniques is Taste of Hate, by the time you've had 10,000 uniques drop, you've probably had a Taste of Hate. So the Affliction content, the Wildwood content, when you play it with a focus on generating purple and yellow juice, and mostly ignoring the blue juice, Once you go back into the main map, you'll find that there's an absolute shower of unique items. It's pretty easy to get 20 a map, and it's possible to get many, many, many more, especially if you've got your Atlas set up in a way that synergizes with what you're doing in the Wildwood, which is basically that you want to add a lot of monsters that inherently have a very high item rarity on them into your maps. Now this can be rare monsters through mechanics like Abyss, it can be rogue exiles, and it can be ghosted monsters. Ghosted monsters in particular are really, really good with this. Now there's a number of ways that you can set up your Atlas in order to get lots of these additional high rarity monsters onto your maps. As I say, I've been using Torment and Rogue Exiles, but other people have been doing other things and it's been working well for them too. Beyond, however, is extraordinary, and whatever you do, you want to spec into Beyond when you're running Wildwood content. Now, all of this is why Taste of Hate use is up so much this league. You can spin the unique wheel so many times by virtue of getting so much increased item rarity, both from the monsters themselves and also from the league mechanic multiplying on top of that, that eventually you're going to hit even pretty rare uniques like Taste of Hate. And this is much more true for more common uniques such as Lightning Coil. Lightning Coil use this league is up from 3.2% at the end of day 14 in the last league to 9.6%. This is not due to any uptick in discussion of this item online. Lightning Coil was just as popular last league. It's just that last league there were fewer of them going around, so for the players that had them it was a really cherished drop, whereas nowadays it's something pretty much anyone can farm, but not necessarily until you've already got a fairly solid character, because the Wildwood content is quite difficult. So Lightning Coil and Taste of Hate utilization is up, but this is true for a lot of other unique items as well. If a unique item is seen as better than almost any rare that could be in its place, and it's also a drop anywhere unique, then its use is up this league. Now one thing that's very important, this does not apply to Sanctum. Sanctum uniques basically don't exist anymore because in order to fix some major issues Sanctum was causing in the trade league, Granny Gear Games nerfed the drop rate of the Sanctum tomes themselves by 40%, from 322 to 323. What this has meant is that there are 0 Original Sins equipped, 0 Eternal Damnations, 1 Sandstorm Visage, and 2 Balance of Terrors equipped across the entire Solo Self-Found League. For a bit of a comparison here, there are 56 players who have got Mage Blood equipped. So that should give you a bit of a sense as to just how rare those Sanctum uniques are currently. And I point out Sanctum here because all of the Sanctum uniques, with the exception of the second rarest one, which is the Staff, all of them are really, really good, and all of them are pretty universally useful, but almost no one is using them because almost no one has them. Alright, so let's have a quick talk about the impact of Transfigured gems. And basically there hasn't been a huge impact yet. I think a big part of this is that players went into 323 apprehensive that the Transfigured gem they wanted to get was going to be much rarer than it actually ended up being. Additionally, people are still solving the best ways to build them. So many players have a preference to start safe, and then maybe pick up some gems on their first character that then they can mule over to a second character later. That said, Penance Brand of Dissolution, Caustic Arrow of Poison, and Scourge Arrow of Menace are all popular, and we'll come back to them and 10 others that have proven popular later in the video. So something I think will be really interesting will be to see how this plays out in patch 3.24. We now know that these Transfigured gems are not as hard to acquire as many players feared pre-launch, even if you're playing in Solo Self-Found. Certainly nothing like the level of dedication or obsession that was necessary to get a Tornado Shot enchant, for example, in previous leagues. So this is something we want to keep an eye on because people might be more willing to league start them, both in 3.24, but also potentially in various player run events like Badger Private League. We might see more people electing to league start one of these gems, just working with a plan to go until maybe level 75 or so, and once they get to 75-ish, then they'll prioritize getting their gem and making whatever respec is needed in order to play the skill they really want to play for all of yellow maps and all of red maps. Next we'll have a quick look at the Ascendancy Spread this league, and this is what a pie chart looks like. You'll see that I've consolidated the lowest performing Ascendancies down into one slice, and we've got the Guardian being the largest slice of pie, a bit less dominant than the Deadeye is in Trade League. Then we have the Deadeye, the Pathfinder, the Elementalist, Inquisitor, Champion, Slayer, Juggernaut, Hierophant, Necromancer, Trickster, Chieftain, and then over here we have the Saboteur, Berserker, Occultist, Raider, Gladiator, Ascendant, and Assassin. So Guardian's on top as we discussed earlier, but this is a single build Ascendancy, and it falls off really hard in popularity once you restrict to level 98 plus characters instead. At that point you'll see that it's Tornado Shot that becomes hegemonic, just like it is over in Trade League. Now what it seems like people are doing is they're starting as a Guardian in order to unlock the Atlas and earn their Void Stones, then they elect to play something else entirely, or at least many people do that, while some people elect to stay as a Guardian. Deadeye is on top at very high levels, where solo self-found does become a bit closer to trade, in the sense that there are more items available. Now the low end of popularity shows the nature of solo self-found. Ascendancies that are tied to specific builds fall off really hard when some of the critical items for those builds aren't around. There's nothing genuinely awful at the moment in the way of ascendancies. Assassin, Raider and Gladiator aren't really the best at anything, but they're all okay at something, and the Ascendant generally just doesn't work well in solo self-found. It's a fine ascendancy, but a lot of the jewels that might pull you towards playing as an Ascendant in Trade League just don't really exist, and a lot of the power of that Ascendancy is tied up in its access to more jewel sockets than most other characters get. That's not really as strong in SSF as it is in Trade, and so the Ascendant is a bit less popular here. So the unrivaled number 1, 15 days into the league, is the Summon Raging Spirit Guardian. In Trade there's also a poison version of the build that plays as a Necromancer, but that is generally really quite hard to get rolling. SRS Guardian has adequate damage, safe playstyle, very easy leveling. Once you hit your first slab, it's pretty much cruise control on until about level 80 or so, and even while you've got this uber minion going around slaughtering everything, your SRS minions do good damage as well. Most players aren't that interested in the Transfigured version, Summon Raging Spirits of Enormity. It's not awful, but the default gem is generally better unless you're playing a fairly specific build, in which case SRS of Enormity is kind of like a different build entirely. In second position on the ladder, we have the Tornado Shot Deadeye. The build is overwhelmingly dominant over in Trade League, and it still comes second in the less favourable to it SSF environment. It has enough damage to function well, and absolutely unparalleled damage projection. The ability to hit things around corners at the edge of the screen, the ability to hit most of the screen at once, that's the strengths of the Tornado Shot, and especially when played as a Deadeye. Historically, this used to be a squishy build, and that was one of its real weaknesses. But since 3.17, it's felt less squishy, and a big part of that is monsters starting to get physical damage overwhelm, which means that converting physical damage away from physical into elements has become more powerful than it was historically, and for builds that are on the right side of the tree, that tends to be their main defensive layer anyway. Convert as much incoming physical damage as you can to other elements, and then get spell suppression, and while you're not giga tanky, you can be quite tanky with that setup. Now this build has benefited from two things in SSF. The first one is what we've already discussed about Taste of Hate and particularly Lightning Coil being much easier to acquire than they've been in the past, and that's only really been in the last week or so since the Affliction mechanic has been a bit better understood. But the main thing is that +1 secondary projectile is a big power boost for this skill. That used to be gated behind the pretty close to Trade League only Labyrinth enchant system, but now it's just gated behind getting 20 quality on your gem. This is not free, it's a fair investment now, but it's also something you can definitely do to deterministically power up your character and get one of the most important upgrades that used to be pretty much Trade League exclusive. Coming in third is a build that wants to burn things but that is not Righteous Fire. We've already mentioned Righteous Fire had a fall from grace, but for people who want to set the world on fire, Vaal Detonate Dead is still there. Ignite versions of this, almost exclusively played as an Elementalist, are doing just fine, and these have been a pretty strong build and have come in third in terms of popularity this league. Boneshatter comes in fourth, and here we have something interesting where this is split between two ascendancies. 40% played as a Juggernaut, 58% as a Slayer, and then there's a small number of champions and other ascendancies. Almost universally, Boneshatter enjoyers are using a two-handed rare axe. Now, Tanu Ahi is incredible on the Juggernaut version, and it's very common. Carnage Heart is good on both versions, and it's also quite common. You'll often see people using one or even both of these uniques. Now, something that's new this league is the option of Boneshatter of Complex Trauma. Most builds won't want this, but it is worth investigating, especially if you happen to come across a two-handed weapon that does not have a good attack speed on it. In that situation, Boneshatter of Complex Trauma may end up being better than the base gem for you. Whatever the case, try it and find out if it works for you or not. And next we have the highest performing of the new skills, Penance Brand of Dissipation. This is almost always run on the Inquisitor Ascendancy, and it's on my shortlist of gems to try out in the future. It's a pretty complex gem. If you want to read up on the mechanics of it, the PathOfExile wiki has a full page about it. Basically, the brand itself levels up the longer it spends attached to enemies, and the higher its level is, the more damage it does both to the enemy that it's attached to, and also to surrounding enemies each time that it ticks. Note that getting level 21 versions of Transfigured gems is non-trivial, especially in solo self-found, and that's something you want to consider if you do decide to play this. You have reasonably easy progression up to gem level 20, but going from 20 to 21 is going to be much harder than it is on a lot of other builds. And rounding out the top 13, we have Lightning Arrow, Caustic Arrow of Poison, Scourge Arrow of Menace, Explosive Arrow Ballista, Splitting Steel, Toxic Rain, Righteous Fire, still in there, and Ball Lightning of Static. It's worth noting that Caustic Arrow of Poison and Scourge Arrow of Menace are often interchangeable, and I wouldn't fault anyone that decided to combine them into one build and consider them to be the same build as each other. If we look only at new gems, the top 13 in terms of level 92 plus play: Penance Brand of Dissipation, Caustic Arrow of Poison, Scourge Arrow of Menace, Boneshatter of Complex Trauma, Ball Lightning of Static, Summon Raging Spirit of Enormity, Storm Brand of Indecision, Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction, Storm Rain of the Conduit, Explosive Trap of Shrapnel, Animate Weapon of Ranged Arms, Toxic Rain of Withering, and in 13th place we have Rain of Arrows of Saturation. Now some of you might notice that I put Boneshatter of Complex Trauma on this list but didn't include it in the previous list, and that's because I consider it still fundamentally to be a Boneshatter build. So essentially I consolidated Boneshatter and Boneshatter of Complex Trauma into one build when I was making the list of the top 13 skills in general, and then when it came to the top 13 new gems only, I then separated out Boneshatter of Complex Trauma. I only do this because those two gems are built fairly similarly. It's just that you value different stats, but they do function in a very similar way. Contrast this to Caustic Arrow of Poison, which is an entirely different gem to base Caustic Arrow. A build that's optimized for one of Caustic Arrow or Caustic Arrow of Poison is generally going to perform pretty badly if you put the other one of those gems in instead of it and change nothing else about the build. Fundamentally, one of those skills is about chaos damage pools on the ground, and the other one is about instant application chaos damage and synergy with poison. Very different, even though they both do chaos damage over time. They do it in such different ways that they are fundamentally different builds. But with Boneshatter of Complex Trauma, it is fundamentally the same mechanics, just with slightly different weighting of stats. Breakout Uniques. Just like in Trade, that which was taken is the main Breakout Unique. This is used by 20% of level 97 plus characters, and for something that's got as much variance as the Watcher's Eye to have that much utility, even in solo self-found, really does indicate that high-level characters want to be farming the King in the Mist often in order to get themselves at least a hard-to-beat that which was taken. Once you've earned 5 or 6 of the item, you're probably not interested in farming him anymore, but that is definitely something you're going to want to get for yourself. Basically, all of the Tier 2 and Tier 3 rarity drop anywhere uniques that are considered best in slot, or at least considered extremely hard to replace, there's been an increase in the use of almost all of these. And for 2 more, Darkness Enthroned use is way up as well, and Ventor's Gamble. Ventor's Gamble use is up quite a bit this league, and a big part of this is just that with so many more unique items dropping, many more of them are Ventor's Gambles, and of those Ventor's Gambles, some of them, not very many, but some of them are going to be well rolled, and if you get a well rolled one, it's an outstanding item to use on pretty much any build. Anyways, I wanted to leave with one final thought, which is actually exactly the same as I finished with for the Trade League summary, and that is you should expect more change than usual as this league develops, because there's a lot of new skills to experiment with and major new interactions that the player base as a whole is still trying to work their way through. For example, Cleave of Rage. This is probably the best melee skill now, but very few people are playing it yet. Ditto Arc of Oscillation. There's a whole bunch of tech around that that's not really well explored. So in short, expect that if I was to repeat this video on day 40 or day 50 of the league, it might look much more different to the days 10 and 15 versions than it would in most other leagues. I'm going to leave this video there. I'm posting it on Christmas Eve, my local, so if you're watching this and Christmas is something you celebrate, then Merry Christmas. If, like me, your uni student job was in retail and you were subjected to hearing Frosty the Snowman just 600 too many times for you to be able to enjoy Christmas anymore, then hopefully you have an enjoyable holiday season anyway. May Aveldo's puzzle boxes contain interesting maps, and hopefully I will see you before the new year, but if not before the new year, then definitely in 2024.